blood slid down her temple as a police officer pressed a gun against her head and whispered, "Even judges have accidents." What he didn't know was that this woman wasn't just another victim, she was a federal judge. And the trap about to spring would bring an entire town's corruption crashing down. How did a simple traffic stop spiral into this moment of life and death? Stay with me, because the answer will shock you. Blood trickled down Eleanor Mitchell's temple, a crimson line catching the dim glow of a broken lamp in the corner of the abandoned house. Her breathing was steady, measured, though a cold barrel pressed hard against her skin. Officer Rollins leaned in close, his voice dripping with mockery. "Not so high and mighty now, are you?" His hand didn't tremble. He had done this before. Behind him, Bennett lingered near the doorway, blocking the only exit, the floorboards groaning under his weight. They thought they had her cornered. They thought she was just another woman who had pushed too far. Eleanor stood still, her shoulders squared, her eyes unwavering even as blood slid down to her jawline. She did not flinch. She did not plead. Decades of courtroom discipline held her calm, even as her life hung by the trigger of a man who despised everything she represented. And yet, in this suffocating room heavy with dust and menace, there was something Rollins did not know. Something Bennett had not considered. They believed they controlled the story. They had no idea this moment was not the beginning, but the culmination of something far greater. The silence stretched. Rollins pressed the gun harder, grinding it against her temple as if to crush her spirit with the steel. His grin widened, cruel and self-assured. "This is how it ends for you," he muttered. But Eleanor's gaze told a different story. A story of patience, of endurance, of someone who had faced men like him before and refused to break. For a second, the room seemed frozen, the stale air vibrating with tension, her dignity standing taller than their weapons. And then, the question must be asked, not to Rollins or Bennett, but to you watching now. How could it possibly come to this? How does a respected woman, with a life built on justice and order, find herself bleeding in an abandoned house, staring down the barrel of a gun wielded by those sworn to uphold the law? This moment is shocking, it is enraging, but it is not the whole story. It is only the middle. To understand how Eleanor Mitchell arrived here, we must step back. Back to the quiet hum of a car engine on a rural road, back to flashing red and blue lights in a rearview mirror, back to a simple traffic stop that was never simple at all. What began as an ordinary drive on an ordinary afternoon would spiral into a chain of events that exposed corruption so deep it had rotted the foundation of an entire town. Stay with me, because this is not just the story of a woman with blood on her face and a gun to her head. This is the story of power abused, of lives upended, of a community suffocated by fear. And it is the story of how one woman's refusal to yield would unravel a system designed to silence her. So let us begin, not here in the shadow of a ruined house, but on that stretch of quiet highway where injustice first revealed itself. Because the road to this moment was paved with more than cruelty. It was paved with arrogance, with prejudice, and with the mistaken belief that no one would ever dare fight back. They were wrong. The late afternoon sun stretched across the Michigan highway as Eleanor Mitchell guided her modest Toyota sedan past rows of bare trees and faded billboards. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, no trace of the judicial robes that had defined so much of her life. To anyone passing by, she was just another middle-aged woman heading out of town, humming softly to a jazz tune playing on the radio. Her destination was her sister Patricia's house, a quiet weekend planned with family after long weeks of courtrooms and deliberations. For a woman who had spent 2 decades weighing evidence and delivering verdicts, these drives were a rare freedom. But freedom ended the moment red and blue lights exploded in her rearview mirror. Eleanor glanced instinctively at the speedometer. 35 miles per hour on a 35 zone, steady as always. She had not swerved, had not rolled through a stop, had done nothing out of place. Still, she signaled calmly and guided her car onto the shoulder, rolling down the window, placing both hands deliberately on the wheel the way her father had taught her when she was just a teenager. 2 officers emerged from the cruiser. One moved to her driver's side, the other circling to the passenger side. Their hands rested too comfortably on their weapons, postures sharp, aggressive. Eleanor remained still, watching them approach in the mirror. The nameplate on the first officer's chest read Rollins. His partner's badge read Bennett. Rollins leaned in, his shadow falling across her face, his eyes narrowing not in professionalism but in appraisal, like a man looking at something he already disliked. "License and registration," he barked, not even pretending to greet her. Eleanor lifted her chin, voice calm and courteous. "Good afternoon, officer. May I ask why I was pulled over?" Bennett scoffed from the other side of the car, a harsh laugh that carried disdain. Rollins' lips twisted. "You were doing 40 in a 35. That's a problem. Now, are we going to have a bigger one if you don't hand over your papers?" Eleanor felt the old, familiar weight of this moment. In her courtroom, she had heard it described countless times. Ordinary black men and women stopped for nothing, accused of speeding or swerving, each encounter escalating faster than it ever should. "I was within the limit, officer," she answered evenly. "But of course, I will provide my license and registration. May I have your badge numbers as well?" Rollins leaned closer, his tone slow and deliberate, each word laced with contempt. "Law doesn't apply to people like you. You just do what you're told." The words hung between them, thick with their real meaning. Eleanor's pulse quickened, but her face revealed nothing. She had heard those exact words in transcripts, seen them written in testimony, dissected them in civil rights cases. Still, she reached slowly toward her purse resting on the passenger seat. Her movements were careful, deliberate, measured. It didn't matter. Bennett's voice tore through the calm like a gunshot. "Weapon!" he shouted, already drawing his firearm. Rollins' hand went instantly to his holster, the metallic snap echoing. In a heartbeat, Eleanor's door was yanked open, her arm seized in a grip rough enough to wrench her shoulder. The quiet hum of a routine drive shattered into chaos. Eleanor's body was spun against the cold steel of her car, the sting of metal biting into her skin as handcuffs snapped tight around her wrists. She heard the clatter of her purse falling to the ground, the papers spilling out, but neither officer looked at them. Rollins sneered, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Resisting arrest. Threatening an officer. That's what we've got here." Bennett rummaged through her belongings, muttering, "Nice car, nice purse. Funny how people like you can afford it." Their tone was not about enforcing the law. It was about reminding her she didn't belong, not here, not anywhere they controlled. Eleanor forced herself to breathe evenly, her mind recording every word, every movement, every violation. She said nothing, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood. The only weapon she could wield in this moment was silence, observation, memory. She had walked into countless courtrooms armed with less and dismantled lies built on arrogance just like this. What began as an ordinary drive had turned into a violent spectacle, not because of any crime committed, but because two men with badges decided power was theirs to abuse. And so, on that stretch of quiet road in a town she had only planned to pass through, Eleanor Mitchell became the latest victim of a story she knew too well. But what these officers could not possibly imagine was that their target was not an ordinary woman. They thought they had found someone powerless. In reality, they had ignited a chain of events that would bring their entire system crashing down. The Westbrook police station looked like a building time had forgotten. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a pale green haze over cracked linoleum floors and water-stained ceiling tiles. A dusty Confederate flag coffee mug sat proudly on one desk, and a framed sign that once read, "Whites Only," hung on the wall as if it were some kind of historical artifact worth displaying. To the officers moving briskly through the halls, these things were decoration. To Eleanor Mitchell, they were evidence. She was marched through the processing area, wrists digging against the steel cuffs, ignored as though she were invisible. No one questioned why a middle-aged woman in jeans and a sweater was being shoved into a holding cell. No one cared. The clang of the cell door echoed in her ears, the sound final, heavy. She rubbed at the angry red lines on her wrists, as her eyes adjusted to the dim space. Inside sat two others, their faces etched with the same exhaustion she felt but for entirely different reasons. A young man, barely 19, paced the cell with restless energy, his sneakers squeaking against the concrete floor. His hoodie hung loose, his eyes darting toward the barred window as though escape might still be possible. On the bench sat a woman in her late 20s, arms folded tight across her chest, her jaw clenched in silent defiance. Eleanor offered a small nod. "I'm Eleanor," she said simply, deliberately withholding her title. The young woman looked up after a long moment. "Tasha," she replied flatly. She gestured toward the boy pacing the floor. "That's Marcus." Marcus stopped, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "They just brought me in. Said I was loitering." His laugh was sharp, bitter. "I was standing in the grocery store parking lot, waiting for my mom. Showed them my work badge and everything. Didn't matter. Next thing I know, I'm in cuffs." Tasha let out a humorless chuckle. "At least they didn't accuse you of stealing perfume." She lifted a plastic shopping bag from beside her, inside it a small box with a receipt taped to it. "I bought this," showed them the proof. "The owner calls the cops anyway, says I tried to walk out without paying. Rollins slapped cuffs on me before I could even finish a sentence." Eleanor listened, every detail imprinting itself in her memory. She asked questions gently, as if merely making conversation, but her mind was working like it did in court, cataloging facts, recognizing patterns. Same officers. Same disregard for rights. Same presumption of guilt. She had seen these stories before, but always from the other side of a bench, reading transcripts or hearing testimony. Now she sat shoulder to shoulder with the victims. Tasha's voice broke for the first time, low but steady. "This isn't new. They've been doing this to people in Oak Lane for years. My cousin got pulled over 3 times in 1 week. No tickets, just harassment." Marcus nodded quickly. "They don't want us there." "My grandma's house? They keep saying her garden's overgrown, issuing fines. She's lived there for 20 years. Suddenly it's a problem now?" Eleanor felt a wave of anger rise, but she forced it down, turning it into clarity. These weren't isolated incidents. This wasn't coincidence. It was a system, carefully constructed and deliberately enforced. Her silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. Rollins and Bennett believed they had humiliated a woman who would disappear quietly into their statistics. What they had really done was give a federal judge a front-row seat to their corruption. Eleanor folded her hands steady as stone. She would not reveal who she was, not yet. If she did, their behavior would shift, the masks would return, and the truth of how they treated ordinary black residents would vanish. No, better to remain Eleanor, the woman in jeans, the one they thought powerless. Because in their arrogance, they would show her everything. In the corner, Marcus muttered under his breath. "They're not even scared. It's like they know nothing can touch them." Tasha looked away, eyes tired. "Because around here, nothing does." The words sank heavy into the stale air, the cell suddenly colder. Eleanor met their gaze one by one, offering no false promises but letting her calm presence speak louder than any speech could. What they didn't yet realize, what Rollins and Bennett could never imagine, was that by throwing her into this cell, they had unintentionally revealed the scope of something far bigger. Eleanor was not alone. This was not her story alone. This was a community under siege. And for the first time, Westbrook's pattern of cruelty had been witnessed by someone with the power, and the resolve, to bring it crashing down. The clatter of keys echoed as Officer Daniels sat at the booking desk, fingers moving quickly across the worn keyboard. He was young, his uniform still crisp compared to the frayed edges of the station around him. He had processed dozens of names that day, each one entered with mechanical detachment. But when he slid Eleanor's ID beneath the flickering scanner, the screen froze. His eyes flicked to the words in front of him. Federal Judge Eleanor Mitchell, Eastern District of Michigan. His breath caught. The color drained from his face. Daniels glanced up at Eleanor, who met his stare with calm, unblinking eyes. In that moment, the silence between them roared louder than any siren. Daniel swallowed hard, leaned back in his chair, and stood quickly. "Excuse me, ma'am," he whispered, almost inaudible. He hurried toward the back offices, disappearing through a door that bore Chief Hargrove's name. Within minutes, the air inside the station shifted. Officers who had been lounging suddenly stood straighter. The joking stopped. A nervous energy rippled through the room. Then the office door burst open, and Chief Hargrove stepped out, his broad frame filling the hallway. His once casual swagger had been replaced by a forced smile stretched too tightly across his face. Beside him came Judge Samuel Crawford, his black robe replaced by a tailored suit, the heavy ring on his hand catching the fluorescent light. Crawford's eyes flickered with calculation as he scanned the room before settling on Eleanor. "Judge Mitchell," Hargrove began loudly, making sure every officer could hear. "What an unfortunate misunderstanding we seem to have here." His voice was syrupy, dripping with false charm. "Had we known—" He trailed off, bowing his head slightly as though offering respect, though his eyes betrayed only fear. Eleanor did not rise. She remained seated at the desk, her composure unnerving them more than any outburst could. She let the silence stretch, watching them squirm. Crawford stepped forward, his tone smoother, practiced. "Colleagues should respect each other's territory," he said softly, his smile never reaching his eyes. "We operate in different spheres, you and I, federal and county. Best to avoid unnecessary complications." It was not a warning spoken aloud, but the message was clear. "Stay out of Westbrook. Leave this to us." Eleanor inclined her head slightly, her voice calm, controlled. "The treatment I received should not happen to any citizen, regardless of their position." The words landed heavily, the subtext undeniable. Around them, the station had become a theater of panic. Officers straightened their uniforms, Confederate mugs and offensive signs were swept hastily into drawers. Bennett and Rollins lingered near the back, their arrogance replaced by pale faces, the weight of realization pressing down on them. Rollins clenched his jaw, a twitch betraying the fear he fought to hide. Bennett avoided her eyes altogether. Chief Hargrove's phone rang and rang again, his hand tightening around the receiver as he muttered promises into the line, his tone desperate. Crawford, meanwhile, leaned closer, dropping his voice to a whisper only Eleanor could hear. "We both know the kind of damage a story like this could cause. For everyone. Let's be wise, Judge Mitchell. Let's be discreet." Eleanor's expression never changed. She gave him nothing. No reassurance, no agreement, no sign of what she intended. She was the same Eleanor Mitchell who had stared down attorneys and witnesses in her courtroom, letting silence itself become the sharpest blade. For a moment, Crawford faltered, shifting uncomfortably as he realized his performance was failing. The balance of power in the room had shifted. Moments earlier, she was just another detainee. Now the entire station was on edge because they had laid hands on someone who held more authority than any of them could imagine. But with that authority came risk. By revealing who she was, the game had changed. She was no longer invisible. She was now a threat. And the men who had built their power on intimidation and silence would not let that threat stand unchallenged. What began as a routine traffic stop had suddenly become a battle of influence and survival, and Westbrook's leaders were already deciding how far they were willing to go to protect themselves. Patricia's house stood at the edge of Westbrook, a modest two-story home with peeling white paint and a garden she tended herself. For Eleanor, it had always been a place of refuge, where the heavy silence of courtrooms gave way to the warmth of family. That evening it felt different. Patricia met her at the door with a binder tucked under one arm, the words Crane Development scrawled across its cover. "You need to see this," she said, ushering her sister inside. The dining table was already covered in papers, property records, code violation notices, maps dotted with red ink. Patricia had been documenting Westbrook for years, compiling stories from neighbors whose lives had been quietly dismantled by the same names Eleanor had just encountered. She flipped open a page. Photographs of Oak Lane homes lined up in neat rows, each one marked as pending acquisition. "They're buying people out," Patricia explained. At prices far below market value. And when families refuse, the police show up. Suddenly there are fines, violations, mysterious break-ins. Until living here becomes impossible. Eleanor ran her fingers over the documents, the pattern unmistakable. Crane Development wasn't just a company expanding its footprint. It was a machine, fueled by the power of police harassment, and sanctioned by Judge Crawford's rubber-stamped courtroom. But as Eleanor absorbed the scope of the scheme, the machine struck back. The first blow came the next morning. The Westbrook Gazette's headlines sprawled across the front page: "Federal Judge Detained After Erratic Behavior." The article painted Eleanor as unstable, suggesting she had used her position to intimidate local officers after being stopped for reckless driving. Anonymous sources spoke of her shouting, of her supposed attempt to leverage power she didn't have. Chief Hargrove's quote was printed in bold: "We regret that a respected judge would behave in such a troubling manner when visiting our community." It was a character assassination carefully crafted to undermine her credibility before she could even speak. Patricia slammed the paper onto the table. "They're trying to bury you, Ellie. This is what they do." The second blow came faster. Marcus's mother called Patricia in tears. Her son had been arrested again, this time accused of selling marijuana in the same grocery store lot where he had been picked up for loitering. The charge was absurd, but bail had been set so high his family couldn't dream of affording it. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. Marcus wasn't just another victim now. He was a silenced witness. With him locked away, his testimony about Westbrook's policing would never see daylight. Tasha's fall came hours later. She called Patricia's house, voice trembling. "They talked to my boss. Said I was unreliable, disruptive. I've worked there 3 years, never a complaint. And now I'm fired." Her sobs cracked through the line. "I can't even pay rent next month." Eleanor closed her eyes, listening, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. Tasha's courage in speaking up had been repaid with retaliation. This was no coincidence. It was strategy. The final strike landed at Patricia's own door. A thick envelope delivered by certified mail. Inside, notice of multiple code violations at her community center. The letter declared the building unsafe, threatened closure within 48 hours unless critical issues were addressed. Patricia's hands shook as she read it aloud. "They passed inspection 3 months ago. None of this is real." Eleanor placed a hand on her sister's arm, steadying her. "It doesn't have to be real," she said quietly. "It only has to be written." The pattern was now undeniable. This wasn't a matter of rogue officers abusing their badges. It was coordinated, systematic, and deliberate. Crane Development wanted Oak Lane. Judge Crawford provided the legal cover. Chief Hargrove and his men supplied the pressure. And anyone who resisted, whether a federal judge, a teenager, a young worker, or a community leader, would be crushed until they were silent. Eleanor walked through Patricia's small living room that evening, her eyes scanning the photographs of family gatherings, holiday dinners, smiling faces of nieces and nephews. She thought of Marcus in his cell, Tasha packing her belongings into boxes she couldn't afford to move, Patricia's center facing demolition. She thought of all the voices that had been stifled before hers, buried under headlines, shackled with fabricated charges, erased from payrolls, evicted from homes their families had held for generations. Her hands gripped the back of a chair as the truth settled over her. Westbrook wasn't simply corrupt. It was being consumed by a conspiracy where the courthouse, the police department, and a developer's office functioned as one body, each protecting the other while they stripped away the lives of those least able to fight back. And now, because she had seen too much, Eleanor Mitchell had become their newest target. What began with flashing lights in a rearview mirror had escalated into a war of power and intimidation. For the first time in her career, she understood what it felt like to have the entire system aligned against her. The question was no longer whether she would fight, but how much it would cost, and whether she could bring the truth to light before Westbrook's machine destroyed everything in its path. The parking lot was nearly empty, the sodium lights above casting pale orange pools across cracked asphalt. Eleanor waited inside her Toyota, engine off, watching the condensation on the windshield blur the outlines of passing cars. She had chosen this place carefully, far from Westbrook's main streets, but close enough that she could leave quickly if something went wrong. The clock on the dashboard ticked past midnight. Then a figure appeared, walking briskly across the lot. Officer Daniels, his uniform jacket pulled tight against the chill, his face tense. He glanced over his shoulder before slipping into the passenger seat. The doors shut softly, and the silence between them was heavy. Eleanor studied him in the dim light. He looked younger than she remembered, the lines of fatigue etched deep for a man not yet 30. He held a folder clutched tight against his chest, as though it might vanish if he loosened his grip. "I don't have much time," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "If they catch me with this—" He didn't finish. Instead, he opened the folder and laid the contents on the dashboard. Printed emails with letterheads from the Westbrook Police Department. Lines highlighted, phrases underlined. Eleanor leaned closer, reading words that confirmed what Patricia's binder had suggested. Target Oak Lane residents, increase traffic stops, enforce code violations aggressively. Her fingers brushed the edge of one page. The language was clinical, but the intent was unmistakable. Daniel's hand moved quickly, producing a small flash drive. "Dashcam footage," he said. "From your arrest. They logged it as missing, claimed the system malfunctioned. But I pulled it before it was erased." Eleanor took the drive, her pulse steady but her mind racing. Proof. Hard proof. He pulled out another sheet, bank transfers to a consulting company run by Chief Hargrove's brother-in-law. The dates matched the spike in arrests and code violations Patricia had tracked. Eleanor felt the pieces locking into place. For the first time since her traffic stop, she saw a path forward. But the moment of relief evaporated as headlights swept across the lot. A cruiser slowed, its beam catching the inside of Eleanor's car. Daniels froze, his breath sharp in his throat. The cruiser paused, the silhouette of an officer visible behind the wheel. For a moment, time stretched unbearably thin. Eleanor kept her face calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as though she were simply waiting for someone. Daniels stared down at his boots, his jaw tight, the folder still open on the dashboard. The cruiser rolled forward slowly, the tires crunching gravel, then continued past them toward the far exit. Only when its taillights disappeared did Daniels exhale. His voice trembled slightly. "They're watching everyone now. If they even suspect I'm talking, I'm finished." Eleanor closed the folder, sliding it back toward him. "Not finished," she said softly. "Protected. If you're willing to testify, I can make sure of that." Daniels shook his head, the fear raw in his eyes. "You don't understand. Around here, people disappear. Accidents happen." He paused, then looked at her, the conflict clear on his face. "But I can't stay quiet. My grandmother lost her home to a scheme just like this. I swore I'd never let it happen again. And now it's happening here." His words carried the weight of conviction, fragile but undeniable. In that moment, Eleanor saw not just a frightened young officer but a man who had chosen conscience over complicity. She nodded slowly. "Then you're not alone anymore." Daniels gathered the papers quickly, leaving only the flash drive in her hand. "This is enough to start. I'll find more, but I have to be careful." He opened the door, glancing once more around the lot. "You're fighting people who believe they're untouchable. Be ready for what they'll do next." He slipped into the shadows, leaving Eleanor alone with the hum of the streetlights and the weight of the evidence in her hand. Hope flickered, fragile but real. The corruption of Westbrook was no longer a story whispered in courtrooms or hidden in Patricia's binders. It now had names, documents, footage, numbers. And it had an insider willing to risk everything. For the first time, Eleanor knew the machine could bleed. But bleeding animals are dangerous. And Westbrook's power brokers were about to realize that the judge they tried to silence had allies in places they never expected. The Wilson house sat at the edge of Oak Lane, its windows shattered, its paint stripped by decades of neglect. Once it had been the proud home of Dr. Wilson, the first black physician in Westbrook, a man who had healed the sick when others refused to treat them. Now it stood hollow and broken, a monument to what the town had chosen to forget. Tonight it was more than a ruin. Tonight it was bait. Federal marshals moved like shadows in the thick woods surrounding the property, their radios silent, their eyes fixed on the darkened house. Inside, Eleanor Mitchell stood in the parlor, the faded wallpaper peeling behind her. For hidden cameras had been installed hours earlier, their lenses capturing every corner of the room. She had chosen her place carefully, not behind cover but in the open, waiting. The silence stretched as night deepened. Then headlights cut across the driveway, sweeping over the weeds that had overrun the front yard. A vehicle pulled in slow, deliberate, blocking her Toyota in place. Doors opened. 2 figures stepped out. Rollins first, swaggering, his flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. Bennett followed, more cautious, his eyes darting toward the shadows as though sensing something was wrong. They approached the porch, weapons resting in their holsters, hands tense. The front door creaked open without a knock. Their lights swept across the dusty room until they found her. Eleanor stood calmly in the center, her posture straight, her face unreadable. Rollins smirked. "Judge Mitchell. Interesting place for a meeting. Planning to buy this dump?" His tone dripped with mockery. Bennett shifted to the doorway, effectively blocking the exit. Rollins stepped further in, circling her like a predator. "Even judges have accidents," he said, his grin widening. "Remote roads, single vehicle crashes, tragic misunderstandings. It happens all the time." Eleanor did not move. Her voice was steady, deliberate. "Officers Rollins and Bennett. I assume Chief Hargrove knows you're here." The question unsettled them. Rollins' smirk faltered for a moment before he recovered. "Routine patrol," he said quickly. "This property has had break-ins. Imagine our surprise finding you here." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Of all the vacant houses in Westbrook, you focus on those in Oak Lane. Especially ones whose owners refused to sell to Victor Crane." The name landed like a stone. Bennett stiffened, shooting Rollins a quick glance. Rollins sneered. "Don't know what you're talking about." But his voice lacked conviction. Eleanor stepped closer, her calm unnerving in the dim light. "I have evidence. Payments from Crane to Hargrove's family. Emails directing officers to target residents. Dashcam footage of my arrest that vanished from your records. This is bigger than harassment. It is conspiracy." Bennett's jaw tightened. "Nobody's going to believe criminals and troublemakers over us. Or over a county judge." Rollins moved in, his face inches from hers, his tone low and menacing. "Crawford thinks you're a liability. Crane says his plans can't wait. And Hargrove agrees. Westbrook would be better off without you." He drew his weapon, the metallic click sharp in the silence. The gun rose until the barrel pressed against her temple, just as it had on the night we first saw her. "So here's how this ends. You decided to meet an informant at an abandoned property. Officers responded. You got agitated, threatening. Tragic mistakes were made. Very sad." His finger brushed the trigger. For a moment the world seemed to stop. The threat was real. The danger undeniable. Yet Eleanor remained still, her breathing even, her gaze locked on his. Her voice was calm, cutting through the tension like glass. "And you believe that story will hold up to a federal investigation?" Rollins leaned closer, the steel grinding against her skin. "What investigation? Your recusal is on record. Crawford will say you're unstable. Crane will say you're bitter. Hargrove will say you overstepped. And the world will believe us." The cameras captured everything, the lights blinking silently from their hidden places. Eleanor waited until his arrogance peaked, until his certainty reached its height. Then she spoke 3 words, clear and sharp. "Federal marshals." Now. The room erupted. Doors burst open, windows shattered as marshals poured in, weapons raised, voices booming with authority. "Drop your gun! Hands up!" Rollins froze, shock flooding his face as his arm was wrenched back, the weapon stripped from his hand. Bennett bolted for the door, but a marshal tackled him before he reached the porch. The chaos lasted seconds, ending with both men face down on the floor, wrists bound, their bravado replaced by panic. Eleanor did not move. She stood as she had stood the entire night, composed, unwavering, her dignity intact even with the mark of a gun pressed into her temple. Around her, the marshals secured the room, radios crackling with confirmation. Across town, simultaneous warrants were being executed at the courthouse, the police station, and Crane's offices. The trap had sprung, and Westbrook's power structure was collapsing in real time. Rollins, his cheek pressed to the dusty floor, looked up at her, disbelief in his eyes. For once he had no words. Eleanor lowered her gaze, her voice steady. "The law applies to everyone. Even you." In that moment the balance of power that had been abused for years shifted irrevocably. The men who thought themselves untouchable were now the ones in chains. And the judge they tried to silence had turned their own arrogance into the evidence that would destroy them. At the same hour Rollins and Bennett were dragged from the Wilson house in handcuffs. Westbrook shook under the weight of federal warrants. Chief Hargrove was found barricaded in his office, frantically shredding papers as though the mountain of corruption could vanish with a few torn pages. It took nearly an hour before younger officers, led by Daniels himself, refused to protect him. He was led out through the front doors of the station he once ruled, his badge stripped, his head lowered. Judge Crawford attempted to flee the county, a hastily packed suitcase and offshore banking documents stuffed into the trunk of his car. Federal agents intercepted him at the highway, his robe of authority replaced with the look of a man caught in his own net. Victor Crane fared no better. At his glass-walled office downtown he tried to buy his way out, whispering promises of millions, even offering Eleanor her own foundation if she would call it all off. She stood across the table, her voice unshaken. "Justice isn't for sale." Minutes later, cameras captured him being escorted out in cuffs, his face twisted with disbelief. Those images traveled farther than any denial could reach. The ripples spread quickly. Marcus was released from his cell, the false charges against him dismissed. He stepped into the daylight, stunned, tears running down his face as Eleanor told him his courage had helped bring the system down. Tasha's case was heard in a federal labor court, her termination ruled unlawful, damages awarded, her name cleared. The relief in her eyes was mixed with sorrow for the years she had lost to fear. Justice had come, but it had not come soon enough to erase the scars. 6 months later, Oak Lane looked different. The community center Patricia had fought to protect thrived with activity. She now led neighborhood meetings, organizing programs funded not by intimidation but by genuine investment. Daniels, no longer a silent witness, had become part of the new leadership of Westbrook's reformed police department, training recruits in constitutional rights and community trust. He carried his grandmother's memory with him into every session, determined not to let history repeat. And Eleanor, summoned to Washington for her confirmation hearing, stood before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Cameras flashed, questions pressed hard. One senator asked whether she had overstepped her role as a judge by involving herself so directly in Westbrook's affairs. She answered with the clarity of someone who had carried truth into the fire. "Justice isn't about saving myself," she said, her voice carrying through the chamber. "It's about protecting those without power. If we turn away when rights are stripped from the vulnerable, then the law means nothing at all." The room fell silent. Behind her sat Patricia, Marcus, and Tasha, reminders of the human cost hidden behind legal jargon. The committee approved her appointment by a narrow margin, a victory shadowed by the weight of what she had endured. Westbrook was healing, but the wounds remained. Families who had lost homes would never get them back. Years stolen by fear and harassment could not be returned. Yet hope lived where despair once ruled. In the streets of Oak Lane, children played freely again, laughter echoing where silence once hung heavy. Eleanor returned to visit one last time before beginning her new post. Driving past the town's welcome sign, she saw a new phrase added beneath the population count, where justice matters for everyone. It was a promise carved out of struggle, born from scars that would not fade, but strong enough to light the path forward. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.